Welcome to this program that has been put together by FLAIR, the First Ladies Association for Research and Education. My name is Myra Gooden. I am the president of FLAIR, and we have in store for you an especially wonderful program this afternoon with two internationally recognized scholars. FLAIR, as many of the viewers of these broadcasts know, was created to sustain a network to promote and publicize research and education about the contributions, lives, impact, and lasting legacy of US First Ladies. This afternoon's program is about a transitional First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, and her work at the United Nations with human rights. Our two scholars are Maureen Beasley and Alita Black. Maureen Beasley is Professor Emerita of Journalism at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism, University of Maryland, College Park. She has specialized in the history of Washington women journalists, including Eleanor Roosevelt, who described herself as a journalist. Maureen is the author of two books focused on Eleanor Roosevelt: Eleanor Roosevelt, Transitional First Lady, and Eleanor Roosevelt and the Media, A Public Quest for Self-Fulfillment. She also is the editor of the White House press conferences of Eleanor Roosevelt and co-editor of the Eleanor Roosevelt Encyclopedia. Her most recent book deals with a journalist friend of Eleanor Roosevelt and is titled Ruby A. Black: Eleanor Roosevelt, Puerto Rico, and Political Journalism in Washington. Alita Black is special advisor and historian to former Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton, visiting distinguished scholar at the Miller Center for the Study of the Presidency at the University of Virginia, an affiliated scholar with the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, and the managing director of the Allenswood Group, LLC, a collaborative she founded to strengthen democracy through education and civic engagement and to preserve and document women's political history. Dr. Black is also recognized as a leading expert on Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I have been looking forward to this program for months, and it is now my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Maureen Beasley.
Thank you very much. The first thing I want to say is how pleased I am that FLAIR exists, and to be part of this program that recognizes the importance of Eleanor Roosevelt, our First Lady from 1933 to 1945, who turned the institution of the First Lady into an important element of the American political system. Now, because my background is in journalism, because I've always been interested in the way Eleanor presented herself, the story I'm going to tell you today about Eleanor is one based on, in fact, some of the things that she did herself to communicate and to make the First Lady's position an important one. Of course, we know that from the days of Martha Washington to the present, the First Lady has always occupied a ceremonial role. But Eleanor, married to the nation's longest, Franklin D. Roosevelt, transformed this position into much more. She made it a partnership that became both a platform for political activism and a symbol of women's increasing independence. I think it's so remarkable that she managed the feat of being her own person, as well as being portrayed as a wife supporting her husband, which she certainly did. For example, let's look at this slide, the Roosevelt 1934. And I like this because it shows Franklin and Eleanor in the White House as equals, and they both seem comfortably at home there. Now, Eleanor overcame initial fears that the role of the First Lady would confine her to social rituals. So she used the media of the day to speak directly to the public and to modernize the role of the president's spouse. And the public responded, seeing the First Lady not as a remote figurehead, but as an actual individual. So please let me share with you this recollection. Picture the scene. We have a drafty frame house in a small town in Missouri in the early 1940s. A little girl is listening to a tired housewife reading aloud from her favorite column in the Kansas City Star. The columnist writes about her life in Washington. Here's a woman going places, doing things, meeting people of note. And suddenly this housewife bursts out, I am sure she is better than he is. Well, that little girl was me, and the housewife, my mother. Of course, the he was Franklin, and the she was Eleanor. The column at hand was Eleanor Roosevelt's My Day, billed as a diary chronicling her activities in and out of the White House. Now, my father was a Republican office holder, and our family did not praise FDR. But to my mother, Eleanor transcended politics by presenting herself as a woman speaking to other women and doing things that would interest women in general. Although often parodied for its customary bland tone, My Day, Eleanor's popular 6-day-a-week column, which she started at the end of 1935 and continued for decades, sometimes hit a feminist nerve, as in this example, which stresses the right of women to have their own careers. Next slide, please. The next slide. Well, uh, uh, yes, okay, here's her My Day, February 1st, 1936, in which she is talking about the right of women to work outside the home. She says, in Germany, I understand, highly trained scientific women are told their minds are no use to their country, that only their ability to bear children and run a house efficiently is of any value. Then she asks, has every human who desires the right to work? And says, there are three fundamentals for human happiness: work, which will produce at least a minimum of material security, love, and faith. These things must be made possible for all human beings, men and women. Directly addressing the public, Eleanor changed this job of being First Lady from simply serving as official hostess to becoming a spokesperson for her husband's administration, the New Deal, and the causes in which she personally believed. She stood out as a role model for millions of American women who admired her for engaging in her own meaningful pursuits. At the same time, she was carrying out the duties of a wife. When Franklin was elected president in 1932, Eleanor wrote in her autobiography she was happy for him, but feared living in the White House would limit her own aspirations. He believed his election would make up for the physical impairment he had suffered from infantile paralysis, and that he would lead the country well during the crisis of the Depression. But for herself, she continued, as I saw it, this meant the end of any personal life of my own. I had watched Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt and had seen what it meant to be the wife of a president, and I can't say I was pleased at the prospect. Of course, Eleanor was the niece of President Theodore Roosevelt and had frequently visited the White House during his presidency from 1901 to 1909, and had observed her Aunt Edith totally occupied with social and family responsibilities. Now, many of us are familiar with the story of Eleanor's life. It's such a dramatic one that included her marriage at the age of 20 to Franklin, her distant cousin, only 3 years older. He had had a happy boyhood at the state at High Park. Eleanor had not been so fortunate. By the time she was 10, both of her parents had died after their marriage had fallen apart in the midst of a public scandal. And Eleanor had gone to live in grandmother's troubled household. Her happiest years were when she was sent to boarding school in England as a teenager. When she came home, she became to engage Franklin over the objections of his domineering mother, Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt, who controlled the couple's purse strings. Let's see slide 3. Ah, yes. Look, here, 1905. We have Franklin, Sarah, and Eleanor. Look, Franklin and Sarah are exchanging very close glances, and Eleanor is sort of looking off in the distance. As Franklin pursued his career, Eleanor, who bore 6 children from 1906 to 1960, one of whom died, immersed herself in the conventional concerns of upper class life. True, after she had come back from Allenswood, the boarding school in England, she had volunteered at a settlement house. So she had some experience with people in dire circumstances. But none of this work continued after her marriage. Sarah and Franklin would not have approved. It just wasn't something that was done by upper class wives at this time. Now, since Eleanor was so young and inexperienced, Sarah sought to run the household and to take charge of the children's upbringing. In 1918, Eleanor received a crushing blow. She discovered Franklin had fallen in love with Lucy Mercer, her social secretary. Eleanor and Franklin thought about a divorce, decided against it, but Eleanor began to build a life for herself. Although she nursed Franklin devotedly when he contracted infantile paralysis in 1921. So before Franklin was elected president in 1932, Eleanor had launched her own career as a writer and teacher, and had become a forceful presence in the women's division of the New York Democratic Party. As she put it in her autobiography, by earning my own money, I had recently enjoyed a certain amount of financial independence and had been able to do things in which I was personally interested. Now, this next slide is going to show how Eleanor had supplemented her inheritance by money she earned before the White House. She earned this money from teaching, writing, editing, speaking, and broadcasting. Her income tax return, 1932, from which this chart is made, testified to the fact that Eleanor had continued to earn money after Franklin was elected governor of New York in 1928, spending only part of each week performing social duties in Albany. Eleanor taught at Todhunter, a private girls' school in New York City that she owned with 2 women friends. They also were partners in a furniture factory at Valkill on the Roosevelt estate at Hyde Park. Now, I think we have to remember back what we've learned about the 1930s and women's role then, and married women basically did not for pay. Of course, there are many exceptions, but basically they didn't. My mother had been a school teacher before she married my father. She had been forced to give up her job because married women couldn't continue teaching at that time in Missouri. Anyway, apprehensive that Franklin's election as president would stop her career, Eleanor confided her fears to a new intimate friend, Lorena Hickok, a reporter for the Associated Press. Hick, as she was called, urged Eleanor to use her White House role to develop contacts with other women journalists. Aware that previously it had been considered unladylike in the public eye for presidents' wives to seek publicity, a nervous Eleanor held her first press conferences for women only on March 6, 1933, days after Franklin's inauguration. She need not have been nervous. This was the first of 348 press conferences to come. that helped establish the First Lady as a figure of importance in the administration's strategies to gain favorable press coverage. Along with announcing White House events at the conferences, Eleanor spotlighted women of achievement as her guests, publicized New Deal programs that aided women and children, and on one occasion protested efforts to cut the federal payroll by firing married women. Yet she was careful never to directly criticize her husband, and she was quite discreet in what she would say about policy matters in public. Here is a picture of one of the first press conferences. The reason Martha Strayer is pointed out there, she worked for the old Washington Daily News. She took shorthand notes on these press conferences, the only real notes we have of them. Now, forced to stop teaching because she did have to give up her job at Tata because of demands of being First Lady, Eleanor soon discovered that having this position enhanced rather than limited other career opportunities. Now, critics accused her of profiting from her position, but nevertheless, she went ahead. She sold magazine articles as well as her My Day column. She wrote books, accepted paid lecture contracts. I ought to say she also gave a lot of unpaid. And she appeared on sponsored radio broadcasts, affirming by example the right of married women to speak out and earn money rather than to be dependent on their husband. Now, let's look at the next slide, which is based on her income tax returns. And it shows that she made substantial money while First Lady. And you have to remember that these are dollars from the 1930s. If we put them in today's inflated scale, she earned now, true, she donated most of her earnings to charity. Announcing in 1934 she was resuming radio broadcasting, determined to get the money for a good cause and take the gap. Her broadcast, like her paid lectures, concentrated on non-controversial topics, like typical days in the White House, but they illustrated use of the platform of First Lady to emphasize commitment to education, youth, and women's participation in politics for social betterment. Traveling far more than her predecessors, Eleanor logged some 300,000 miles from 1933 to 1941, acting as a fact finder for the physically impaired Franklin. She gained extensive press coverage for visits to New Deal projects, again enhancing the importance of the First Lady's position. Her role escalated in 1939 when she announced in My Day she was resigning from the Daughters of the American Revolution because it refused to allow Marian Anderson, the acclaimed African-American singer, to perform in its segregated Washington concert hall. Far more outspoken proponent of civil rights than Franklin, Eleanor was listed as the first sponsor of Anderson's subsequent concert on Easter Sunday before an integrated crowd at the Lincoln Memorial. And here we have a picture of Eleanor giving an NAACP medal to Marian Anderson. When the United States entered World War II, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, Eleanor, due to a pre-existing contract with the sponsor, delivered a radio speech calling on civilians to support their country, even before Franklin addressed the nation. She continued this appeal to patriotism throughout the war, flying over the world to visit service personnel. Some decried her travels during a time of gasoline ration, but most praised her morale-building activities. When detractors ridiculed her physical appearance and chided her for not staying home with her husband, vast segments of the public admired her. In 1939, the Gallup poll found 67% of Americans approved of her as First Lady, 67%, compared to 58% who approved of Franklin's actions as president. Time magazine featured her on its cover and called her the world's foremost female political force. So, like my mother, a majority of Americans must have thought that she is better than him. Of course, after Franklin's death in 1945, Eleanor went on to serve as U.S. delegate to the United Nations, where, as the distinguished historian Alida Black will tell you, she was the leading spirit behind adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When she died in 1962, the news media referred to her as the First Lady of the World, a tribute to the way she had transformed the First Lady role. And here we see her with the Declaration of Human Rights. I know now that Dr. Black is going to tell us much more about the human rights story. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. Before we go on to Dr. Black, I'd just like to remind everyone, if you have questions, all of our friends in the audience this afternoon, please put them into the chat box, and they will be relayed to me, and I will be happy to ask our two participants to share their thoughts about those questions. Now we move on to Dr. Alida Black.
Hello, everybody. I'm happy to see you virtually, at least imagine you on the other side of the screen. And I want to give a special shout out to my buddy, Anita McBride, for her glorious work to help set up FLAIR, as well as Nancy and Myra for their leadership. And in my 17 minutes, which for me is going to be the shortest time I have ever talked about Eleanor in my entire life, I am going to give you a rapid fire introduction to Eleanor as a woman of policy sense, a political animal that we are just now beginning to understand, and to argue against all of the prevalent portrayals of her that are defined her as, you know, the traditional woman of sorrow who was orphaned, her mother called her granny, her father was a drunk, FDR cheated on her, gag me with a pitchfork. Is that as clear as I can possibly be about that interpretation? Eleanor was political way before Lucy. Eleanor started politics when she was 14 and 15 at Allenswood. And what I want to do now is to try to tell you, well, try to introduce you to the woman that I have gotten to know over 30 years of working on Eleanor, and to say that the only way that you can understand her or even begin to grapple with her engagement, the courage, the attacks, the sadness, the joy, the relations that she built, is to look beyond her papers at the FDR Library. Because while they are a national treasure, and I spent every day 4 years and cashed in everything I own to read them, there are massive gaps there because Eleanor did not want her influence known. And so she removed smoking gun documents from those papers that really demonstrated her influence on politics and policy. And the only way to reconstruct them is to visit the archives of those she corresponded with and trusted, the papers of their confidants, to see whom Eleanor's handwritten letters were forwarded to. This woman wrote voluminous handwritten letters. There are no carbon copies. So to really understand what she did and what you thought, it's like reconstructing a great Louise Penny mystery novel. I mean, you have extraordinary characters. You have crises and violence and economic despair, family tensions, racial violence, religious suspicion. And you have a woman who, from her earliest days, as a young girl, is trying to figure out how to have her own voice. And so by the time that sorry, I'm looking at my time, so I'll know which story to tell so I can quit on time. But, before FDR, she finds out about FDR and Lucy, Eleanor is already immensely political. The record is very clear that she on her own is lobbying legislators in Albany for specific legislation that she cares about. She is already involved in international women's organizations. She translates in 3 languages for the International Women Working of the World Conference in the middle of the First World War to try to talk about how women can be engaged in peacemaking, policy peacemaking. She is reading reports that come out from the Wilson White House on what the war plans are. So when FDR is stricken with polio, Eleanor has 2 crises to face, both the crises of the man that she loves and that they are trying to carve out a relationship that is based in a different kind of love rather than a high school crush, and figure out how to see each other as equals, and figure out how to give each other the space that they need to be the people that they become while still supporting each other. So when Franklin is stricken with polio, Eleanor is thinking, oh my God, we got to figure out how to help Franklin because so profoundly depressed. But at the other time, it's like I have finally built a life for myself. And now am I going to have to give up everything I've done to take care of a husband whose mother wants him to return to be a gentleman squire in Hyde Park? So if you look at that first battle between them and how the 2 of them resolved that, you get a real sense of the partnership that will develop from that. Eleanor, after FDR gets polio, Franklin and Eleanor will never spend more than 6 months a year together for any year since from 1921 until his death in 1945. By the time that FDR runs for governor of New York, Al Smith, is trying to get him to run, and FDR wants to run in 32, and FDR won't take his phone calls, and Eleanor gets him to take his phone call. And the reason that Al Smith wants FDR to run for governor is a quote directly from Al Smith to his key aide, Belle Moskowitz. And that is, we must have FDR running in 1928 because his wife is more well-known among the party faithful than any Democrat in the state. Eleanor is traveling nonstop. By the time that FDR becomes governor, she is on the board of 11 policy-oriented organizations in the state that relate to immigration, labor, the minimum wage, international peace organizations, the precursor to the UN, has become a nationally recognized champion for the World Court, so that by the time FDR is president in 1932, Eleanor has full-page articles on her in the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the articles in the Crises, in Los Angeles papers, full-page articles on her as a political operative. The reason that Eleanor does not want to be First Lady is that, as she says to a dear friend, the White House eats women. And so she asked FDR, how she can avoid living in what she called the Great Fishbowl. She offers to do his mail. He says no. She says, can I help you with your calendar? He says no. She says, can I travel like I did before? He says no. She writes her daughter I turn my face to the wall. I wish I could cry, but I can't. To live a life defined by a white glove test, meaning, you put your Washington social women would go in the White House with their white gloves and run their hands up the banister to see how clear and clean the White House was. Eleanor does not want to do this. Louis Howe sort of kicks her into gear and says, I'm tired of you pouting in the White House. You got to get out. So let's go for a drive. They end up in Anacostia with the Bonus Army encampment. And for those of you who don't know what the Bonus Army is, they're American veterans. They were the first Americans ever to leave our shores to fight in a foreign war. And it's the Great Depression. They've lost everything, literally. They have walked from California. They have hopped freight trains. They have thumbed rides, and they are living in what now some of the Smithsonian is built on, in tents made of corrugated cardboard and newspaper. Eleanor goes, she wants to stop, she goes, she spends hours with them. She eats beans out of a can with her fingers. She goes into a tent, takes off her chemise, gives it to one woman whose clothes is so translucent. She talks to people about where they're from, what their jobs were like, what they need. What can she do to help lobby Congress to pass the legislation that they are camping out to insist be enacted? The next day, there's no boom mic behind her. There's no press conference. She hadn't called anybody, and Washington being an even tinier town than it is now, the gossip started. And the next day, both the Washington Post, which then is the third least important, a third of ranked number 3 in terms of importance in Washington newspapers. Both the Washington Star, the Washington Post, and the New York Times report this line. FDR sent Hoover sent the troops. FDR sent his wife. At that point, FDR realizes that Eleanor can be good copy. And so Eleanor, working with Louis Howe, has outflanked Franklin to figure out how to become engaged in ways that she thinks is substantive. Okay, now bear with me because I got 6 minutes before I got to stop. And I'm going to give you a Gatling gun paced introduction to Eleanor and policy in the United States in ways that help set up her expertise to mediate, moderate, spur, and negotiate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I might add before we get started, is of more influence and has been replicated in more state constitutions than our own Constitution and our own Bill of Rights. So this is not an inconsequential journey. Eleanor begins to understand the power of immigration, the power of sanitation, the power of the living wage when she is in school at Allenswood, because Mademoiselle Soubesse teaches her 2 things. You never know what you think until you can argue the position of your fiercest critic with equal integrity and insight. And the second thing is, when you go abroad, you are not a guest. You must contribute. That means you just don't go to the opera. You just don't go to the fine stores and the museums. You volunteer in soup kitchens. You volunteer in hospitals. You volunteer in homeless communities. And so Eleanor begins to understand that and what that means in a way that is very different from the noblesse oblige charity approach that her family instilled in her as a child. Oh, come on, just go give turkeys to the poor newsboys. So she comes home with that insight. And so from that work with immigrant communities, you get immigration reform, the Economy Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and Eleanor's bedrock conviction to support the World Court, where she becomes the White House spokesperson and advocate on why the World Court is important. It is Eleanor on the radio to debate the key Republican opponents of the World Court. Eleanor is involved in discussions about the early United Nations. The last meeting she has in the White House is with Charles Tausig, where FDR brain truster, who appeals to Eleanor to change FDR's mind in the trusteeship mandate debate about what is going to happen to these small nations at the end of the Second World War. She becomes a major housing advocate, both from the Southern Conference on Human Welfare, the farm home mortgage banks that are set up, the women's participation in the CCC, and is blamed, is so outspoken that she is blamed for the race riot in the 1943 Detroit race riot, which was over the housing of Black defense workers who were living in the snow, in the park, in a blizzard, in newspaper reinforced tents. And goes to that so that the New York Times would say, it's blood on your head, Mrs. Roosevelt, for spending so much time on housing and race. Which gives me to, how much time do I have? Okay, 45 seconds on Eleanor and race. Eleanor has the largest FBI file in American history at that point, prior to the assassination of Malcolm X. 97% about that is based on race. J. Edgar Hoover thought she was passing as Black. She was so outspoken, objected to her policy position so much that he reached out to the Senate Judiciary Committee to hold a special hearing to declare her colored, strip her of her citizenship, and send her to Liberia to live with her people, the coloreds. During the Second World War, Eleanor objected and fought tooth and nail to plasma being given to people of the same race. She fought tooth and nail for African American women to, in fact, receive equal pay. Just to give you an example, every ounce of nitroglycerin that was produced in the Second World War was produced, loaded, distributed, driven, and unloaded by Black women. What does that tell you about expendability? She says the closest friend in her own age group is Mary McLeod Bethune, the gigantic Titan. The importance of the Marian Anderson concert is not just, can I have one more minute? Okay. The importance of the Marian Anderson concert is not just making the Lincoln Memorial the civil rights shrine, not just Eleanor understanding this is how she can use her column for a total voice, but the coalition that was formed around the Marian Anderson concert was the same coalition that forces FDR to sign Executive Order 8802, which establishes the Fair Employment Practices Commission. So Eleanor was a player. You know, we can spend 5 years talking about Eleanor and the Declaration. Is she the most important first lady in our history in terms of policy? No. Nancy Reagan and Hillary Clinton are. Did she set that precedent? Absolutely. And the one thing that I want to say in conclusion is that there is there was only one person in the world that could have negotiated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor was selected by the member nations of the United Nations to negotiate that, which is intended to be a legally binding document. One nation in the United Nations objected to her appointment, and that was us. She totally proved us wrong. And Eleanor's stature as a risk-taking, courageous policy person who owned up to her ingenuity or her mistakes, but who always stayed engaged, is this example. There are more schools named for Eleanor Roosevelt outside the United States than there are within our own country. So thank you all. I really encourage you, if you're any graduate students out there, my email is really easy. It's my name at Gmail. Email me. There are dissertation and books to be written on this woman. Do not believe the superficial portrait.
Thank you both. I am hoping that we're going to get some questions from the audience. But while we're waiting for them, Maureen, I'm just wondering, is there anything else that you would like to add to your comments, or is there anything you'd like to observe about what Alida has just shared with us?
Well, I just hope Alida writes a biography of Eleanor. It does show of the importance of Eleanor in policy making. I know Alida's done a tremendous amount of work to try to track down information which truly is missing from the papers at Hyde Park. We don't know exactly what Eleanor said to Franklin, and we don't know exactly what he did, and we don't know exactly her influence on the administration at this point. So I'm so glad that Alida is looking into all this. I'm sure it's a tremendous archival job.
Well, we went to 263 archives in 50 states and 9 nations, and we haven't found it all yet. I just have to say that everywhere I've gone, that then Secretary Clinton sent me to do work with grassroots organization and lawyers on human rights, every single person came up to me and had Eleanor stories or had questions about how she kept people at the table. I mean, she is incredibly influential around the world still.
Alida, we were talking about this before we began the program, and you were decrying the usual conception of Eleanor. Could you give us a little more grounding in a more realistic portrait of Mrs. Roosevelt?
Well, if you wanted a hook, I guess, one way to do it is how Eleanor found her voice and how her voice changed over time. And a woman that was strong enough to debate Wyszynski, the greatest debater in the world in the UN, and with the charisma of Obama and the voice of James Earl Jones, and basically fillet him on the floor of the General Assembly, is not a woman who is easily intimidated. A woman who flew during the war into 2 war zones, first during the bombing of London, and then the second to fly an unpressurized military aircraft and through bombing zones, and then go in submarines and submarine infested waters, and have her eardrum shattered because of the pressure on the plane, and then spend 5 weeks in a war zone is not a wuss, and I think what I keep in my wallet, I keep 2 things. One from Bette Midler that I can't say on the Zoom, and another one from Eleanor Roosevelt. And I am a gleeful agnostic, but this is her wartime prayer. And it's, dear Lord, lest I continue in my complacent ways, help me to remember that somewhere someone died for me today. And if there be war, help me to ask and remember, am I worth dying for? And Eleanor carried that in her wallet throughout the war, whether she was in MASH hospitals, foxholes, USO tents, walking the bombed out streets of London, USO canteens here. She took that responsibility very clearly and believed passionately in accountability and the power of negotiation. And the greatest line about this, I wish it was mine, but I had a freshman who worked with me on the Eleanor Project, who now is the only American to get a doctorate degree in human rights from Oxford. And this young woman said to me, Alita, she just had a Velcro butt. She would not leave the table.
We have a question from one of our audience members who asks, did Eleanor look to any past first ladies as models?
Maureen, you want to take it?
Well, yes, I think she looked at them. They weren't models she wanted to follow. I don't think she found any thing about her predecessors that she really wanted to emulate. She wanted to broaden the role. She didn't want to be sitting in the White House and pouring tea.
Yeah, I think the biggest first lady that influenced her was Edith Wilson. You know, in I'm sorry, Ellen Wilson, with her anti-poverty, racial housing work. But as what's a possibility, but also Edith Roosevelt showed her exactly what she did not want to be. I mean, she did not want to be a caretaker of the White House or confined to the social aspect. She loved the social aspect. I mean, she was great with it. I mean, she posed for Vogue, she loved clothes, but she had to learn to find her own way. And I think the people that supported her the most were Louis Howe and Harry Hopkins and Lorena Hickok and Bethune were the people that she really leaned on to figure out how to manage this, as well as her great friends in labor, Maud Schwartz and Rose Schneiderman. And there really had been a falling out with the women with whom she had built Valkill by that time. So she's really trying to find her own way, and at the same time redefine her marriage and be responsible and laugh. I mean, this one was not dour. She laughed. I'm like 99.9999999% convinced that she short cheated Winston Churchill in the White House.
Another of our audience members asks of both of you, in your views, should first ladies be policy makers? ER certainly establishes that role as the most important, but are most first ladies up to the task?
Well, I'll just start by saying I don't think anybody could emulate Eleanor Roosevelt. The task today, too, though, is different. It's a different era. Women have different opportunities. I think it's wonderful that Jill Biden is continuing to teach at a community college while she's first lady. The role is different. And of course, I think it'll be not too far. We have the first gentleman or whatever title may be given to the to a spouse of a woman president. Should a first lady be elected? Well, no, obviously, but should a first lady be salaried? Because she is representing the country. What is her role in policy making? I don't think you can say, because the spouse of whoever is in the White House would have so many different characteristics depending on that individual person. I wonder what Alita's ideas are.
I disagree. I think that anybody who thinks the first ladies are not involved in policy discussion are smoking the smallest narcotic there is. You know, right now, the presidency is an incredibly complicated, fast-paced, global position. And the spouses that have been in, now, you know, there's Bess Truman, there's Pat Nixon, who was involved in trade, but Lady Bird Johnson had a huge role in civil rights, Head Start, and we stereotype her as beautification. You know, Nancy Reagan was incredibly involved in policy and was a major force in Reagan's ability to negotiate with Gorbachev. You know, look at the role that Betty Ford had in terms of the Nixon pardon. I mean, these are major people. Anybody who believes that Barbara Bush just put on pearls, fake pearls, and take care of her dogs, I mean, this woman was the gatekeeper and the de facto centurion and was wicked smart. And we would have not had the Bush administration's response to AIDS policy and the Ryan White Act without Barbara Bush. You know, I mean, these women are by and large very smart, and it is up to them and their spouses to define their roles. But many of them are lawyers, they are policymakers, they bring decades of experience into the White House. You know, so anybody who thinks that the First Lady is not engaged in significant discussions either has a horrible relationship with their spouse or has a mindset that goes back to, you know, pre-suffrage, anti-suffrage mindsets. And it is their job description to serve the nation to the best of their capacity. Their job description is not just to be a hostess in the White House. And just as the president is supposed to be head of state and head of government, in the 21st century, the First Lady is also the first woman. And that means that she, like every other woman on the planet, has to figure out how to manage her family responsibilities, her civic obligations with her own career skills.
Thank you. Alita, I know that you have to leave us for members of our audience. Alita is about to give a speech to an international audience. So thank you so much, Alita, for your participation. Thank you both for your enlightening comments. Before we say goodnight this evening, I'd like to remind everyone that we have another program coming up early next year on January 13th. And at that point, we have two scholars who will be talking about Jacqueline Kennedy. Please consider joining FLAIR, and please have a look at our website. It is flair-net.org. Maureen, I'm going to give you the last word. If there's anything else that you'd like to add tonight.
I think it's wonderful that we here at the time we're celebrating human rights. This is the Human Rights Day, or I believe today or tomorrow. It's wonderful that we're talking about Eleanor Roosevelt so much to promote the idea of human rights as a basic for a world. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be on this program with a distinguished colleague like Alita Black.
Thank you so much. I'd like to wish everyone a happy, safe, and restful holiday season, and we hope that we'll see you at the Jacqueline Kennedy program next year. Good night. Thanks so much, Maureen.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.